welcome to Driving Force Radio, where we seek to discover what drives today's leaders. On today's show, it's Community Matters. And there is nothing like that in this season to give and during this holiday season, because community does matter. And working in your communities, partnering in your communities are so important. Today, my co-host is CRISTIN TARR, the founder and managing director of Business Service Corps, a Denver-based organization that works with community organizations, nonprofits, as well as businesses, and helps them create these social impact changes and social impact programs that work in our communities. Welcome to the show, CRISTIN.
Thank you so much for having me again.
So, CRISTIN, talk a little bit about community partnerships for social impact. What does that mean?
Well, I think we're taking a different road. Corporations and businesses are taking a different road where they, instead of writing just a check each year, once a year, especially this time of year, they're looking at a partnership within the community where they can actually make an impact. Their employees, in-kind donations, volunteerism, and just really giving them maybe intellectual help within the organization, the nonprofit organization, to really bring them to a new level and build capacity of those nonprofits. And it could be just one that they're partnering with or several, depending on the corporation, but all working towards a cause.
Well, and I want to bring that out. As we've seen over the last month or so, so many huge things have gone on here in Colorado as well as around the country. Everything from wildfires here in the West to hurricanes and flooding on the East Coast. So when we talk about these donations of money and in-kind donations and volunteerism, I mean, I think most people think of it at this mass scale.
Yes.
Can it go down to a smaller organization? And if so, what does that look like?
Absolutely. And I think that that's a really good telling consequence or results, rather, of what happens with, for example, with Sandy. You know, the communities across the world came together to help the victims of Sandy. Why can't we do that on a smaller scale with businesses and corporations in their local communities, making an impact, working with nonprofits, working maybe with a governmental agency to really make an impact on an outcome, whether it's education graduation rates, whether it's parks and recs, recreation areas that you want to beautify your area, whatever really is a passionate and aligned with that corporation, they should put all their efforts in and all the resources in order to make that effort, and still make business sense and business value for their organization. And really what the outcome is a better world that we're living in, a better community that we're living in, a stronger community.
Absolutely. And I know today we have three very different organizations in three totally different sectors, but all community organizations that are out there partnering with businesses and non-governmental organizations and all kinds of organizations to really create this change in our communities. Yes?
I am very excited about the three guests we have. There are three different nonprofits that all of them are focusing on youth and children in some capacity, but they're completely different and their outcomes are completely different, and that's what you're going to find today.
I love that. Our first guest is Pat Greenway, the executive director of Colorado-based Listen Foundation. The Listen Foundation was founded in 1969 by a group of dedicated parents whose children were deaf, and yet they had the benefit of a program where they learned to listen and talk with the use of hearing aids and auditory verbal therapy. And so we're going to learn more about the Listen Foundation here, and welcome Pat to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to be here.
So Pat, tell us a little bit about the Listen Foundation and what the goal of the organization is.
The Listen Foundation works with children who are deaf and hard of hearing, and we teach them how to learn spoken language by listening. And I know it's hard to get your head around that, because how does a child who's deaf listen? Well, what happens is when you receive either hearing aids or cochlear implants, you suddenly have access to sound, but your brain doesn't know what to do with that sound. And so what the therapists do with these children is they teach them how to make sense of sound. So they actually learn how to hear. And once you learn how to hear and you can discriminate words and all the sounds in your environment, then you can learn to talk by listening. And that is how you and I learned how to talk.
Sure.
So the result of that is a much more natural sounding voice, and it allows the children to be part of the hearing world.
And the interesting, I've seen or listened to some of the children that have gone through the program, and it's quite different than signing and lip reading. Is that correct?
Oh, it's very different. The main distinction is the listening component. We work very hard on training the auditory center of your brain. And so that's the biggest difference. And what that means to the child is research has shown that at least 50% and up to 90% of what a child learns is through incidental listening, just conversations around them. So if I'm using sign language or I can only lip read, all of that information that's happening around me, I miss out on.
Right.
So that's huge. It's huge from a socialization standpoint, and it's huge from an academic standpoint.
And Jan, I've really sat down and talked to some of these children, and you would not know that they're deaf.
Really?
That's how well their spoken language is just unbelievable. And transformation that happens is pretty remarkable. Why isn't all children that are deaf going through this program?
It's an outreach situation. It's not knowing the program exists. And that's the critical piece that we really need to work on, because with today's technology, with cochlear implants and high-powered hearing aids and auditory verbal therapy, all children that have a hearing loss should be on an equal playing field as typical hearing peers. And so we have to get that word out. Over 90% of children who are born deaf are born to hearing parents. So this is not something you're expecting. When you get that diagnosis, it's coming at you from left field. And so in Colorado, the home intervention or the early intervention program is home-based, and it's run through the Colorado School for the Deaf and Blind. So typically your first exposure to a professional in this arena is someone who is wanting you to learn sign language so you can immediately communicate with your child. Well, that birth to 3 period in brain development is critical. So I want all families to know that this program is out there so that you can immediately, from birth, start developing listening skills with your child. So by the time they reach preschool and kindergarten, they're ready for regular public or whatever your neighborhood school is.
And they're not signing, and they're not lip reading.
There's no signing nor lip reading, because again, these children are born with an overdeveloped visual center in their brain. You don't want to strengthen that. You want to take that auditory center that is just sitting around waiting to be stimulated, and you want to bring that forward. Then later on, once they've established oral language, you can always learn sign language as a secondary language, so that you can kind of move in and out of both worlds. But you got to establish that spoken language early.
So Pat, you talked about that birth to 3 window of really getting this auditory verbal therapy going, but you're talking about the kids that are out there. So it's birth to 3. There's some steps in there. What is the high range of age groups that you work with?
Well, we'll work with all children from birth to age 18.
Okay.
Okay. But what you see is, you know, from birth to 3, the results are outstanding. From 3 to 7, about half the children will be on the same level as their hearing peers. And then after age 7, it starts to drop off. So you can always improve listening, you can always improve speech, but I'm talking about the difference between what you and I traditionally think of deaf talk versus a child who's indistinguishable from their hearing peers.
Sure.
So there is a
big difference to start early. Now, is insurance cover all this for parents?
Some insurances do. Not all insurance covers speech language rehab services. And that was really where the origin of the Listen Foundation came from. Parents who had been through this program looked at each other and said, these results are so outstanding, this should be made available to all children, not just children whose parents have the resources to pay for it. So our main mission is to raise funds so that we can support children who come from families that could never afford this. Can you imagine being deaf and being from a low-income family? You don't have a chance in life.
Right.
You know, so we want, if we invest in these children at an early age, they're off and running. They are no longer the responsibility of society.
Right. Well, and that kind of leads me to this next question about sort of the lifetime costs associated with a disability. And I think that's the right word. But what is the difference in the lifetime cost between those that learn to sign or lip read versus those that understand how to speak and listen?
That is really the fork in the road. You know, what is your choice? If I choose a sign language approach for my child, this is, you know, what we're looking at. We're looking at a child who can't communicate with everyone, even their family members. Most parents who learn sign language never get beyond a kindergarten level. So you cannot fully communicate with your own child. That child is going to go to school, and by the age of 17, typically will have a reading level of the 3rd or 4th grade.
Wow.
45% of children who sign don't even graduate from high school, and only 5% go on to college.
Wow.
So you look at the lifetime cost of medical costs, special education costs, under and unemployment, and you're looking at $1.2 million that society assumes.
Per child.
Per child. Conversely, you go through an auditory verbal therapy program, it for an entire year costs $5,000 for a child.
Oh my gosh.
You have this program for 4 or 5 years, and that child is independent, excelling at school because this is a literacy-based program. So auditory verbal kids who are deaf tend to score higher in reading than their typical hearing peers because they have such a strong literacy foundation when they enter school.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So, you know, my whole goal is to look at changing expectations for these kids. This is really what it's all about. We all have our stereotype of what we think a deaf child can achieve, and when they achieve that, we're like, woohoo, they're doing great. But I say, no, they're doing terrible because you should be comparing them to hearing children. There should be no difference in language and speech, in academics, in socialization. That's where we need to get the public to understand, is that this is what can happen with these children. So you can mitigate that disability.
Yeah, advocacy is one that you really need to, as a parent finding out that their child is deaf in the hospital. Do they know automatically that there's this
auditory verbal therapy? No.
Yes.
No, because like I said, their first professional that they meet is not an auditory verbal therapist, typically. It would be a deaf educator.
Which is a sign language
which is more sign language based. Or they're introduced to a program that is called total communication, where you learn a little bit of everything, a little bit of listening, a little bit of sign language, a little bit of lip reading, you know, thinking that if you introduce a child to all methodologies, that sounds like it would be a good thing, doesn't it? But the research shows is that you have to focus on the listening and spoken language. If that's what your outcome that you want for your child, you have to start right away with that methodology.
So it's really coming back, Pat, to the first thing that, one of the first things that you said was that one of those critical barriers is sort of that outreach. And then it requires sort of a paradigm shift, if you will, in the healthcare industry, as well as the education industry, to sort of see this shift in what the outcome looks like, correct?
Right, exactly. Exactly, because if you knew that outcome was available to you, you would demand it right away.
You would demand it in a minute, and you wouldn't even waste your time or resources on any of the others. So I guess my question is are there therapists, are there enough folks out there that if this paradigm shift really happened and this outreach could hit scale, are there enough people trained to be able to do this kind of auditory verbal therapy in Colorado as well as nationally?
Every deaf child.
For every deaf child.
In Colorado, we have 6 certified auditory verbal therapists.
Wow.
There's probably just a little over 200 worldwide. Back in the 1980s, Listen was actually responsible for the training. It's a postgraduate training. It takes many, many hours, not only of the academic piece, but also the mentoring piece to achieve this national certification. And so back in the 80s, Listen taught that to speech language pathologists and audiologists throughout the world. They would come to Denver and get their training, then they would go back to their state or their country and start their own program. So if you look at all the auditory verbal therapy programs in the world, they all track back to the Listen Foundation. Wow. Now, you know, that's not something that we could maintain. So today, A.G. Bell National, outside of Washington, D.C., they're now responsible for the training. And they looked at this problem and they said, it takes so much to become an auditory verbal therapist, maybe we can have different levels of certification so we can get more people out there. And so now they have a listening and spoken language specialist certification that you can get that doesn't require as much training, but at least gets the listening and spoken language out there more in the general arena. And then if you want to go on and get your auditory verbal therapy certification, you can, but it's getting more people out there. So they're very successful in staging it now.
One thing I think is really important for our listeners to know is how they can make a difference as individuals, or how corporations can really help you along in first outreach, advocacy, and getting the support that you need in order for every child that comes to your facility opportunity to go through the program.
And that's really the crux of it. You know, once the word is out, then we need the funds to be able to support these children. We have now launched a teletherapy program so that kids in the rural part of the state or outside of the state can actually get this therapy through Skype.
Oh, that's great.
And the beauty of it is that this is a parent-centered therapy. The parent is actually our primary client. We teach the parent how to work with the child. So they go home and the parent can work with the child 24/7, because you're not going to get these results with an hour of therapy a week. It requires total family involvement. And so that's why it's so cost effective too, because you're only with the professional an hour a week, and then you're with mom or dad the rest of the time working on listening and spoken language.
And you recognize if somebody wants to take on 2 or 3 children, that's $15,000 with a almost $4 million benefit to our society.
Right, absolutely.
I mean, that is small dollars. And so in terms of the benefits, and then these children can actually function with everybody in the communities around them. To me, this is a clear example of social impact, of how you as an organization can make a social impact by just sponsoring 1 or 2 children going through these programs, and the benefits that we gain from our not only the individual that's going through the program, but our tax base and helping the society, individuals succeed.
So Pat, tell listeners how they can learn more about the fantastic programs going on at the Listen Foundation.
There's several ways. They can always reach me at the Listen office. Again, my name's Pat Greenway. I'm the executive director, and the number at Listen is 303-781-9440. They can go on the internet and look up listenfoundation.org and find out more of the structure of the foundation. I have a very active Facebook and Twitter site, so if they're social media folks, they can go that route. So there's many ways that they can reach us.
Well, Pat, it was so interesting to learn about what a fantastic organization you have at the Listen Foundation. And to learn more about the Listen Foundation, call Pat directly at 303-781-9440 or go online to listenfoundation.org.